Hi and welcome back. It's actually been kind of a minute since I've filmed footage, like I've been editing and uploading videos, but everything that I have uploaded recently I filmed in like May, and it's now early June. So I guess I'm a little bit rusty. Anyway, welcome back. My name is Lynn. I'm a speculative fiction writer, and this is going to be the start of a new series where I just talk about really cliche, overdone writing advice and try to turn it into something that's actually useful and helpful for writers. So today's piece of advice is going to be show don't tell. But before I get into that, I guess I'm going to go back to doing that thing where I talk about what I've been reading lately. And the book that I have been reading lately has been Folklorn by Angela Mi-Young Her. This is a relatively recent release. It is adult literary fiction. It's got a speculative vibe to it. It's sort of genre-defying in a way, but it is essentially about a Korean-American PhD candidate. I don't really understand how grad school works, so I can't say for certain. And basically, throughout the course of the book, she's investigating her family's legacy, specifically after the death of her mother, and how their family ties into a bunch of Korean folktales. It's a really interesting book. It's kind of a lot. Like, sometimes I have to put it down and step away because specifically the family trauma is, I feel like that could be a lot for some people. It's really done well, but maybe a little too well, if you know what I mean. But if you're looking for something that's a little bit different from most of the things that are currently on the market, and you're in particular drawn to really gorgeous prose, as well as a sort of self-deprecating voice, it is in first person for the most part, definitely something to check out. Okay, back to the video. So today's piece of advice that we're going to be dissecting or looking at from a couple of different angles is show don't tell. If you haven't heard this before, it is pretty much one of the most cliched pieces of writing advice ever, but it's also really frustrating because it kind of doesn't mean anything. It's such a generic and nebulous piece of advice that when you receive it as feedback on your work, it can be really frustrating trying to figure out what the person actually means when they say this. And yeah, it's already frustrating on one level when you're getting it from beta readers, but it's even more so when you get it from agents and editors. And I also feel like this is one of those things where once you get the gist of it and you kind of understand what this is saying, you can spot it in other people's work, but it's really hard to see in your own stuff. So today I'm going to be talking about that. As always, my usual disclaimer is that no writing advice is universal, and so my take on this may not be your take. Prescriptivist writing advice is for the birds, so we're just going to keep that in mind while we move forward. I'm going to be breaking this TED Talk, maybe, up into two parts, and first we're going to be talking about show don't tell on the line level and then on the story level. So show don't tell on the line level is basically in regards to sentences. Like, some sentences show and some sentences tell, and some don't do either. What? That's a really frustrating and tedious thing to have to deal with, especially if you are, if you do have a really solid story, characters, everything. It's just that on the line level, you tend to lean too much on telling. When we boil it down, show and tell aren't inherently better than each other. Show versus tell. You know what I mean. There is a time and place for each type of sentence, for each version. There's definitely a time and place for each type of sentence. And I think one of the things that most frustrates me when people discuss this topic is there's that really cliche line that I feel like a bunch of English teachers have used on me before, where it's don't tell the reader that the moon is shining, show them the glint of light off of broken glass. That is a little bit too much for me, in my opinion. I just think that there definitely is a time for brevity, there's a time to just get to the point and establish things and move on. And then there's a time to linger on scenes and really flesh out the details, and especially if you're doing a deep POV, first person, or just deep third, there's also a time to linger on how that person is reacting or sensing or perceiving these things. So again, every writer should, that's my opinion, but they should be using a healthy mix of both show and tell on the line level. Too much show gets really tedious, drags things out, makes things muddled and confusing. Too much telling puts a lot of distance between the, point of view character or whatever and the reader, and it can be a little bit boring and artless. So you want to know when to use each type of thing. And when we're talking about show don't tell as a piece of feedback, There is a tendency for, I feel like, newer writers to rely a little bit more on telling. I think this is something I really have struggled with before. I also find this in people who really like to outline very thoroughly. They just sort of want to get to the point and tell the story in the most efficient way possible. And there's nothing wrong with that, but in a book you do want a little bit of pizzazz. You want a little bit of that showing. So for me, the basic rule of thumb is to use showing when you really want a scene or moment or a character description to have a lot of impact. Let's say you have a nice neighbor character, you're introducing them for the first time, and you want the reader to know that this person is important, that they're not just background. Would you just say she was nice, she was blonde, or would you maybe linger on the descriptions of her freckles, her long nose, blonde hair, you know, that shines like wheat, or whatever it is that blonde hair does? Would you talk about how, instead of just being nice, she is super polite, always calls people ma'am, brings them a rhubarb pie when they first move in? Because if this character is important, you don't want to just tell the reader that she's a nice person. You want to actually show her being welcoming, being nice in a specific way as well. So definitely there's a benefit to showing versus telling when you're introducing important characters to the story. Showing is also important for establishing settings that are relevant to the story. I kind of hate it. I hate both things. I hate white room syndrome, and I also hate books that just... Hate is a strong word. Don't like the extreme opposite where it's just describing every location and setting and just going down to the minutiae of the chandeliers or whatever. It's very tedious to me, but if it's someone's childhood home and that's really important to them, like a prison where they've just been sentenced to life. I like how my two ideas were a childhood home and a prison. But, you know, basically settings that are relevant to the plot or where the character is going to be spending a lot of time, settings that represent something. So you have to decide what's important and what gets to be shown versus what gets to just be told. Showing is basically just what you do when you really, really want something to have full impact, when you want to linger on a person, a place, a feeling, a scene. So it's absolutely critical that you know how to utilize both and be able to cycle between them pretty easily. And showing is done primarily through sensory descriptions, physical descriptions, emotional descriptions if you're doing it from a certain point of view. That whole five senses thing, or writers use all five senses in their writing, that is something that shouldn't be done all the time, but should definitely be done in moments when you're showing instead of telling. But again, showing isn't always automatically better. Too much showing can slow down a story, it can be really distracting, it can definitely confuse the reader if you're going overboard, maybe even lean into purple prose territory. It can elongate your word count like way more than you'd expect it to, especially if you're sort of in your head. And I've done this before where I was in my head thinking, oh, I have to be showing more than telling, even when that wasn't necessarily the case for the scene that I was working on. Telling can be more effective, or leaning more on telling. Again, every scene should have a mix of both, but leaning more on telling can be effective for a fast-paced action scene, just anything where you need to get through it quickly and show that stuff is happening one after the other. Don't linger on the sensation of a punch if they're getting punched a million times in a row, and that sort of thing. And honestly, my top advice for show don't tell on the line level is not to like fuss too much over which is better for which scene. Just read a lot of writers who are really experienced and that you think are good, and get a sense of the natural flow of show, don't tell, or show versus tell, or show and tell on the line level, and how they sort of navigate through that and use it effectively. And my last note on this is just some ways to recognize too much telling in your work. Too much showing is a little bit obvious. You'll get lots of notes about purple prose, and it'll probably be like a 200,000 word book. Too much telling is repetitive sentence structure a lot of the time. A lot of like subject, verb, etc., if you know what I mean. Another thing is using the to be verb too much. So I am sad, I am hungry, he was angry, he was miserable, that sort of thing. That indicates a lot of telling. It's probably like the biggest indicator. And then the last thing is just stating abstract concepts instead of exploring them. Like describing characters' emotional state in one word is usually not something you want to do, especially in a more character-focused story. I feel like you can get a little bit more leeway with physical descriptions, like, you know, red hair. You can get wild with the similes, but there's really not that many ways to say someone has red hair. Same thing goes for describing relationships, like, he was her friend. You kind of want to show that friendship, especially if it's relevant to the story. And then on the flip side, too much showing can be indicated by just really long text, uneven pacing, you take a little bit too much time on the grocery shopping scene as opposed to the confession scene, which goes a lot quicker because there's less to describe. I don't know. And then beta readers responding with too many questions about what's going on or what the point of that scene was. All right, we're rolling through this. Okay, so part 2 is show versus tell on the story level. And this is sort of where my mind goes when I hear this advice. I know that isn't the case for most people, I think. I hate making generalizations like that, but for the most part, most of the advice about show versus tell seems to be geared toward the line level, but it's definitely something that exists on the story level, and I'm going to talk about it. So show versus tell on the scene level or the story level is basically a matter of which scenes are shown versus which scenes are relayed to you afterwards. I actually don't know if that makes any sense, because I feel like it's a really basic concept that you don't think about that often because it's just so basic. But when you're telling a story, you're obviously not showing every second of this character's life, from the moment that the story begins, the inciting incident, to the conclusion. You're not showing the grocery trips, the bathroom breaks, brushing their teeth, sleeping. You're showing the scenes that are important to the story. And this is really intuitive for a lot of people and less so for others, because once you start to think about it, I think, it becomes a lot more complicated than you initially believed. Because, and here is my sort of confession, I think that almost every book has at least one scene that is unnecessary and one scene that should have been shown to the reader instead of skipped over. And this is sort of due to a lot of reasons. I think a lot of people, again, because it's such an intuitive concept, you don't really think about this, think with your brain, active thinking. Another thing is pacing really complicates this, kind of a lot. Sacrifices have to be made, especially in revision mode, when you have to get to a certain word count. And sometimes plot just takes precedence over character, or character over world building, or, whatever works for the story. So with that, the question sort of becomes how do you decide which scenes to keep and show and which scenes to toss or tell? And it's sort of up to you, completely. For the most part, most writers are going to want to omit scenes that are meandering or don't really contribute much to the forward momentum of the plot, like grocery shopping. But then what if grocery shopping becomes a really important bonding moment for two characters who haven't really had a moment to connect before? Maybe they like the same kind of soup. This is really irrelevant. And then there's the scenario in which this grocery shopping scene isn't just important to character bonding, it is also important to the plot itself. Let's say that these characters are picking up ingredients to bake a poisoned cake to defeat their villain with. It's really stupid. I actually don't really like that example. So you sort of have to decide. And there's another option, of course, and it's making a more plot-relevant scene multitask by giving this character bonding moment to that scene. But sometimes you just want a quieter, more mundane moment for characters to bond without the stress of impending death. And now that I'm thinking about it more, I definitely want to do a video covering scene relevance and what scenes to include. But right now, since we're talking about show versus tell, yeah, definitely knowing which scenes to include and which scenes take precedence versus which ones you just want to do a one-liner to establish that it happened. For example, for the grocery shopping scenario, if it was important to the plot, you just want to say something in a more relevant scene oh, Sandra went to go pick up some eggs earlier, something like that to establish that they have eggs. And that would be telling that scene instead of showing it. That was a lot of rambling, and I am, once again, pretty sure that I didn't get my point across. But once you understand what you're trying to say in your writing, or what your theme is, and once you understand your plot's structure and where you might have room for breaks or, more filler type scenes, you can start to decide which scenes to show and which scenes to tell. And just like with the line level show versus tell thing, a lot of this comes with practice. It comes with reading a lot, understanding story structure, which I recommend that everyone does, even if they don't necessarily conform to them in their books. I just think having a baseline understanding of standard structure is really helpful for this kind of thing, and deciding which scenes, should be shown and which should be told. And it's definitely something that, even though you're aware of this, I still get tripped up by it sometimes, especially when I'm in a rush. I'm oh, I'll just tell this scene that really might be important or relevant to the plot later because I don't want to deal with it. That's bad, but it happens. So that pretty much covers everything that I wanted to cover about this. If you have any insight into show versus tell or your own experiences, drop that in the comments below. I'd love to read about it. And if you have any suggestions for other cliched writing advice I could tackle in the future, you can mention that in the comments as well. Otherwise, be sure to like and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys in 2 weeks.